Good day to all of you, and thanks for your interest in INAM and the AdMaCom program. My name is Oliver Hasse. I'm Managing Director of INAM, the Innovation Network for Advanced Materials, and in the next 20-30 minutes or so, I intend to share a bit more about both the organization INAM as well as our advanced materials competition, so that you have a bit more information than is available on the web. And in the second half of the session, or after my presentation, I'd very much like to open the mic and address any questions that you might have about our program and what it's all about. So that's the very simple agenda for today. And I hope that will address most of the questions that you are having. If not, as I said, there is ample time to actually deep dive into any of these that you might have after my presentation. So let me start off with who are we and what are we all about? So we start with the tenet that actually most of the innovations that particularly drive our current progress and ecosystems are based on materials innovation, as a matter of fact. If you look at compute, if you look at batteries, if you look at aerospace and related industries, a lot of materials innovations have basically enabled the level of economic as well as progress in general that we've experienced. So that basically led us to think a few years back, let's focus on these very enabling innovations, knowing both that they're very crucial, but also very hard to commercialize. Hard to commercialize in the sense that it takes much, much longer than other products and therefore might need to get some additional support. So this is why we've essentially set up INAM in 2016 at 10 years ago, actually 10 and a half these days, when I take the official founding date. And this was with the intent to give focused support to innovators and innovations and entrepreneurs and everybody else in the field of advanced materials to bring their innovations to the market. So to that end, we've on the one hand, from the very outset, focused on the internationalization of the ecosystem, because we know that both the supply as well as the value chains in advanced materials are per se global. And we've experienced that for many years to the better because international supply chains were running smoothly. But as of late, of course, we've had some issues with that. You may remember the chip crisis during the corona pandemic. You might also remember the current discussions about battery materials and other materials that are needed for a transition of the energy system. So that said, of course, certain risks are attached to the international supply chains. It's still operating. They're still operating, or many companies, of course, are still operating in an international manner, and so are we. Besides that, we've seen that, and this is kind of a stark contrast point to other startup ecosystems that you might have come across. And both, of course, a challenge for us as well as a benefit to most of the partners and members and startups in our ecosystem, which means that we're trying to be highly specialized in the particular challenges, opportunities, industries, and of course, expertise is needed for advanced materials startups and innovators. A third goal, of course, is to enable innovation through networking, hence the name network. And the networking part is basically part of our day-to-day work, but in particular in our program. So what we are trying to address is, of course, industry or corporate innovation needs, and thereby make a valid and much more sound matching between startups that are in the market and what is actually needed by industry. Brackets open, and investors, of course, but these go hand in hand, obviously. This means two things in essence. So when I look at the startups that we've had in our ecosystem and in our programs in particular, we both see blue ocean startups, i.e. bring a completely new thing to the world, but also a lot of red ocean, i.e. addressing particular innovation challenges on the corporate side. We like to take care of either of these directions, because blue ocean might eventually then become red ocean if then a kind of market creation dynamism hasn't taken up. A good example, of course, is the material graphene, which has been invented in the lab a good 20 years ago and has multiple application areas. I think only like 5 years ago, companies really started getting a grip and getting a hold in the industrial world to be able to sell their products. But these days, we see graphene in batteries, we see them in supercapacitors, we see it as a sensing device, we see it as a shielding device, we see it as a coating. So there are many, many approaches these days. So in essence, then what we do is strategic scouting, and most of the startups that we actually reach out to for a reason, because we think they could be interesting for addressing one of the challenges of our corporate partners. And that's basically the day-to-day work. Then, of course, we run our ecosystem/startup programs, which do the same thing in a very condensed way, striking a balance between red and blue ocean. So it's not only particular challenges that we're trying to address with the startups that go into our program, but also looking beyond the immediate needs and looking at mega trends, et cetera, to basically also inspire the potential customers and investors. And then, of course, we aim to build and maintain active networks so that we can make these easy introductions, because nothing is more frustrating than the usual business development/sales task of sending out 2,000 emails, getting 10 responses, and maybe 2 appointments. We try to, save you from that, and AI might make everything easier on the kind of general business development side of things, but yet we think that warm intros are much more beneficial and much better time invested than doing mass mailings, particularly for the early stage startups where you have a small team, i.e. limited resources, and therefore limited time to actually pursue these things. So from that perspective, we have set up and operate 3 distinct startup programs since 2022. For the first 6 years, we just had one program, the AdMaCom, which was at the time kind of a one-size-fits-all program. But with the evolution not only of the deep tech ecosystem around the world, or ecosystems around the world, but also the professionalization of the advanced materials startup space, we found that we need to differentiate a bit out to be able to address more specifically the needs of startups in the different phases. And particularly with AdMaCom, startups being around TRL 4 to 6. So around seed stage, we see that there is big need in basically scaling industrial interactions, running POCs and pilots and gaining first revenue through that. So this is essentially what we're addressing in that program. We do have a couple of priorities, but they don't mean that these are the only things that we're focusing on. So on the one hand, there is materials for electronics and electrification, which ranges from, display technology to PCBs, from batteries to electric vehicles or electronic components for electric vehicles. And finally, also anything in between these things. Of course, then secondly, as a, let's say, sub element of this section, we have the materials for the future of compute, and that recently has included materials for chips, of course. Good example is our Atma Lab alumnus company, Nextco EPI, that are using gallium oxide for not kind of laptop computer chips, but for power management chips. But there's also, apart from chip technology, process optimization, purification, packaging processes, et cetera. There's also, of course, nowadays the question of data centers, which includes not only cooling technologies as such, but also transmission technologies. So we're very open to look at all of these fields. Big topic has become both due to, let's say, political focus, as well as the discussion around resilience, which is also politically driven. There is a quite strong focus now also on the recyclability and or recyclable and circular materials from a number of perspectives. We're looking at that. We're looking at recycling processes. We're looking at materials that are easier to be recycled. And we are also, of course, looking at replacement materials, i.e. materials that can replace a, let's say, critical material, which is difficult to get in the world market. And a new topic that has been around for a bit, but has not been our core focus in recent years is, let's call it a bit broader, digitalization in the materials lab, in particular artificial intelligence and in materials R&D. This is kind of a topic which, of course, falls into the area of process optimization and materials development, but can also look at things around error detection, thereby improving yield in production. If we look at our track record, and on the title slide, you might have seen the bottom right of corner that we've been put onto the list of the FT's leading European startup hubs ranking for the last 3 years, which is the 3 years that the ranking has existed. But even beyond that, I think we have quite some interesting track record KPIs to show. One that we've been focusing on from the beginning was the survival rate. So at the moment, across the roughly 160 startups that have gone through our programs, 91% are still operational. Some have grown massively, some have grown not so fast, which is then reflected in the relatively modest funding that they have raised of nearing 500 million sometime soon, which has two reasons, I believe. One is that Advanced Materials has, in the last 5 years, taken up a lot of investor interest. Only before that, it was really difficult to raise a lot of funding for startups that focus on advanced materials for reasons of long lead times or long times to market, often technical complexities that were, let's say, not so easy to understand for VCs that were used to business models from the digital world. Brackets open, where you mainly had marketing risk and little technology risk. But this, of course, has changed. And nowadays we see not only many more VCs focusing on our space, but also larger investments being placed, or larger bets, we can say, placed on advanced materials. Black Semicon being one case in point only in the last couple of years. The other question, of course, is, and this is something where we are pretty agnostic, if you're an advanced materials startup, you don't necessarily need to go the VC way. We're very happy to have companies in our programs that plan to grow organically, and certainly at the latest seed stage, which is equivalent to TRF 4 to 6 in most cases, and or running industry pilots. You should probably be starting to decide whether you would actually want to go the VC way or whether you want to grow organically, meaning through revenue incomes, revenue through services, for instance, or launching products and, let's say, lower tech markets, et cetera, et cetera. If we look at our top performers, there is a bunch of startups that have done pretty well for our rearm. The best in class these days is Sellafield, which is doing 3D printed shoes, and they've closed their Series A3 last month. Well, 2 months ago now, and now have attracted almost 100 million at a valuation of 500 million. So not just yet a unicorn, but there are rumors on platforms that they might want to IPO. And I guess the IPO valuation would then be kind of close to or above unicorn, i.e. 1 billion. Then we have Traceless. Traceless have also grown nicely and organically. Their biggest success in recent months was their opening of their first large size production plant. So they did have a pilot production plant before that. And now they've basically started their first large scale production. Atlan 3D is basically reinventing ALD, atomic layer depositioning, through a number of ways, thereby making much more efficient the process of using ALD in various areas of electronics, increasing yield, reducing waste, and thereby making it much better. ICOMAT, one of the first startups of our post-corona in-person AdMaCom in 2022, has recently raised a significant amount. They're into 3D printing of special materials, which particularly are interesting in the space, aerospace and defense sector these days. And VS Particles, they're a typical example of slow growth. They've been around, I think, for a good 12 years. But they raised a substantial amount last year for their technology, which is also enhancing semiconductor production. Right. Now let's come to AdMaCom 2026 and the elements that we see there. So who should apply? I think broadly I've outlined that already. Startups that are focusing on a product that is related to advanced materials innovation, that can be a novel material, that can be a novel process to create this material. It can be a novel process to be used in the context of the broader advanced materials field, for instance, in semiconductor production. It can be also a new use case for a novel material and basically the production technology and process to get that material into that new use case. So it's quite a wide field in terms of products and in terms of verticals. Even though we have our sweet spot, I believe in anything around automotive, electronics, compute, and thereabouts. We do have, through, let's say, sensor technologies from startups in the life science healthcare space and packaging space, etc. Technology readiness is, of course, an important bit, and we'd like to see startups in the bracket TRL 4 to 6. So your lab prototype should be running relatively smoothly, and that's kind of the minimal condition. And it should be or you should be looking to start working with industry to test it in real life environments. Then, of course, we would like to see some growth mindset, i.e. people that have an intention to grow their company, that are dedicated to their company, that want to move things forward and don't see it simply as a side project because maybe that PhD grant didn't come in this year. Finally, of course, the technology should have some significance to industry. So ideally in your pre-seed phase, if you've already determined kind of your niche or your go-to-market and identified the needs of industry that you want to address and that you want to then place your product in. So in a nutshell, what sets AdMaCom apart? We're one of the few programs that are really focused on advanced materials startups. And that means that the trainers that we have, the mentors we have, they're not generalists. They're at the very least focused on advanced materials startups for a number of years, if not material scientists or completely immersed into a material science company or investor already. And that means that they know that there's oftentimes, high capital intensity, also long lead times, as I've mentioned before, meaning that this doesn't have to be explained in every mentoring session, for instance, that you might be having. So people start with a completely different baseline in terms of knowledge than in a generalist startup program. As I said before, we have a selection process that looks at both needs as well as achievements and, of course, potential. And the exact process I'll outline before, but key thing to note here, selection is mainly done by the INAM corporate members, which means that once you are in the program, a number of industrial companies and therefore potential customers have already indicated that there is an interest in your technology. Besides that, of course, we run training sessions that you usually have on startup programs, such as pitch training and business planning, but again, is run by trainers that we have been working with for a long time and that are quite used to the sometimes complex stories that you have to tell, the complex business models or go-to-market strategies that you have to develop, and therefore have a certain degree of expertise in guiding you through these exercises. What is surely a standalone feature of our program is the mentoring sessions that we set up for you. We have a pool of, I'd say, around about 150 mentors across industry, investors, experts from academia, as well as the commercial world, that have been volunteering as mentors in the past, brackets open. That's actually how I got to know INAM in the past. I was the first 4 years of my interactions with the organization, I was a mentor on the program on financing strategies. Our mentor database is then, once we've selected the finalist, activated, and we set up curated connections. The mentoring is a bit different to what you usually experience in startup programs. So it's not one mentor that accompanies you. We basically do intro sessions during which you meet around 15. Usually in the past years, it's been 15 to 20 mentors of different walks of life, curated according to your needs as well as to the mentor's expertise and experience. And then you meet them in the course of the program in 45-minute sessions and can have a first touch point with them. And then you can decide what to do with this new connection. Some you will say, okay, we had nice input, but nothing more to follow up with. But some you will also say, we'll stay in touch and collaborate on whichever basis, whether it's a corporate and they become a client, whether it's an investor and you basically start negotiating or start kind of the investment process, or whether it's an expert that you want to then deep dive into and get some services from them. That means that you do get very balanced exposure to industry and investors through the mentoring sessions, but also through the other modules that we've set up. So we're planning on a investor workshop, as we call it, which is sort of a mini pitch day, but not on stage and without any pressure. But you get honest feedbacks from specialized investors on your pitch, your delivery, and whatever else they want to tell you. I've mentioned our track record already, so I think that speaks for its own. So no more comments on that. And finally, I would like to mention that we have this powerful international ecosystem, which means that you don't only have corporates, potential clients, investors, and also fellow startups from, let's say, Berlin or Germany, but really from around the world, which of course is a big benefit in every dimension, as you can expand your potential client base as well as investor base beyond the confines of a single geography. The program pretty much spreads over 3 weeks, and these 3 weeks are split between 2 online weeks and 1 offline or in-person week, which usually is the most intense one. We're trying to balance somehow the kind of dynamism of a program with the operational requirements and needs that you will have to fulfill during these 3 weeks. We've been experimenting with various setups in our programs, and basically I've come to the conclusion that 3 weeks with 2 weeks online, 1 week or 4 days in person in Berlin is kind of a good modus operandi. As for the workshops and also Berlin Week, there is, of course, a preference to have founders in the workshops. However, depending on the size of your team, you might, for instance, for the IP strategy or legal aspects, send a person that is specialized on that. It really depends on the size of your team. As I've mentioned before, there's plenty of mentoring sessions. So 2 basically every week. We're trying to compress it into 4-hour slots during which you meet 4 different mentors in these 45-minute sessions. Sometimes it doesn't all work out, but at the very least, we are trying to accommodate it this way. Obviously, during the first 2 weeks, the mentorings are online, whereas in the last week, most of the mentorings are in fact in person. So you'll be meeting a lot of people from our Berlin or Germany focused networks. Some people come from abroad, but this is kind of the general setup. And in between, of course, you have the workshops. The whole program starts with a kickoff, which is sort of internal to the program and INAM. So You'll meet your fellow finalists. You'll meet many of the mentors that we'll be mentoring. You'll meet some of the trainers and certainly also our sponsors and get a first glimpse at the final program. We usually run a short intro and info session on the Friday before to just make you familiar with the platform that we'll be putting on the material. And prior to the program, selected candidates will unfortunately have to complete a questionnaire, which is all about your specific needs, some data that we need for promoting you in the course of the program. But that's usually quite a lean process. So what are the next steps? And I'm a bit wary of time, but let's look at that. So the written application through the application form on our website can be submitted until the 15th of August. So you have another 10 days to actually submit. During the next phase, our members can essentially review the startups and comment upon them, and basically work along a point scale, 1 to 5 in various dimensions. And after that, the top 20 to 25 startups out of usually 100 to 120 are discussed during the selection committee meeting, which is going to be held in the first week of September. Likely to be on the 2nd, actually. That's what we're planning with internally. So that also during the second half of that week, you'll be knowing whether you've made it onto the program or not. Just a short overview of the core team of INAM. So there's myself and my scouting team, but then there's also the board, which is very involved in our activities and resembles quite nicely the different stakeholders we have in our association. So with Marcin, we have it's not a startup anymore, I guess, but he set up a startup which has now grown to an established enterprise. So he's gone through the growth process. We have with Emil Liskatovil, an academic expert on advanced materials, particularly in the field of thin films, coatings, hybrid devices. We have Sven Schilf, who's an international IP expert and lawyer. We have Gerrit, he's from the Berlin Economic Development Agency, but also a very avid ecosystem builder with lots of connections, not only in Berlin, but around the world. And finally, we have Tatjana Königsmann, a innovation program manager from our corporate member MKS Agritech, and her particular focus is on coatings and other technologies around the needs of semiconductor industry, automotive industry, electronics industry, and some lower tech. I believe that's it from my side. So I'm very happy and very open to have your questions.